At 2 in the morning, the city went soft, and the man in the corner booth was asleep again. Della Marsh knew it the way she knew everything in the lantern by now, by the small wrongness of it. The coffee cup had stopped turning under his thumb. His head had tipped against the window glass, and the harbour light slid across his face in slow blue intervals, in time with the boy out past the pier. Summer had come up the coast that week and stayed. Even at this hour, the air through the propped front door was warm as breath, carrying salt and fryer oil, and the green smell of the linden trees that nobody in the city had planted on purpose. The fan over the register pushed it all around in a circle and gave up. She finished wiping the counter, hung the rag on the rail, and stood for a moment with her palms flat on the cool laminate, looking at him. She did not know his name. That was the strange part. The part she had stopped trying to explain to Pearl. 3 weeks of this, and she knew the exact angle his shoulders made when the day had been too long for him. And she knew he took his coffee black and left it half-finished. And she knew he tipped like a man apologizing for something. And she did not know his name. He came in a little before midnight, every night, in a good coat gone shapeless from being slept in. And he sat in the booth at the far end where the light was worst, and he watched the harbour as though he were waiting for a ship that he already knew was not coming. And he could not drive himself home. Not because he drank. He never drank, not once, not so much as a beer. She would have noticed. She noticed everything. But because he was the kind of tired that has no bottom to it. The first night, 3 weeks ago, he had stood up to go, and the floor had tilted under him. And she had watched him steady himself on the back of the booth with both hands, and breathe through it like a man learning the trick of standing. She had taken one look at the keys in his fist, and the dark glass of the door, and the long bridge between the city and wherever he was going, and she had made a decision she still could not entirely account for. "Okay," she had said. "Give me those." Tonight she crossed the floor, her sneakers tacky on the just-mopped tile, and stood over him, close enough to feel the cool radiating off the window glass against his cheek, and said it again, gently, the way you wake someone you have decided to be careful with. "Hey, we're closing." He came up out of sleep all at once, the way the bone-tired do, his hand already moving for the keys on the table. His eyes found her, and something in him unclenched a fraction. She had seen that too, every night, and had not let herself wonder what it meant. "What time is it?" he said. His voice was low and worn smooth, like a stair tread. "Late. Time you let me drive you again." She held out her hand. "Keys." "I can man it." Della said. The fan over the register ticked through its warm, useless circle. "You said that the first night, right before you nearly went down on my clean floor. Keys." He looked at her hand for a moment, that good, shapeless coat hanging off him, and then he set the keys into her palm with the particular care of a man handing over something heavier than it looked. His fingers were warm. There was a brass tag on the ring, old and rubbed bright at the edges, with a number stamped into it, and a word she couldn't read in the bad light. She closed her hand around it. "Pearl," she called toward the kitchen pass. "I'm running him home. 20 minutes. Pearl's voice came back flat and unbothered, the way it always did at 2 in the morning. "If you marry a stranger off the night shift, I'm not coming to the wedding. I've seen how this place pays." "Nobody's marrying anybody." "That's what they all say at 2 a.m. A pause, the scrape of a tray. "Drive safe. Take the bridge, not the tunnel. The tunnel's a confession booth." Out at the curb his car was the kind of quiet, dark, expensive thing that she had learned to stop being surprised by. The first night she had assumed he'd borrowed it. By the third night, she had stopped assuming anything. It started with a sound like a held breath. She pulled out onto Harbour Street, and the city unspooled the way it only did this late. Empty, and clean, and entirely theirs. The streetlights laying down their long amber stripes, the warm night coming in the cracked window, and lifting the hair off the back of her neck. He didn't talk for the first 10 blocks. He never did. He sat with his head back and his eyes half closed and let her drive him through the dark, and she had decided early not to fill the silence, because the silence was clearly the thing he had come to the lantern to buy and could not get anywhere else. "You don't ask," he said finally, somewhere around the bridge. "Ask what?" "Anything." He was watching the harbor slide by below the rail, the dark water stitched with reflected light, the warm wind off it coming through his cracked window and smelling of salt and tide. Most people, by now, they'd have asked. "I figure if you wanted me to know a thing, you'd tell me the thing." She took the bridge slow, the way Pearl said. "Anyway, I know the important parts. Do you? You're somebody who used to sleep fine and doesn't anymore," Della said. "You drink your coffee like it's punishment. You tip like you broke something, and you come to my diner instead of going home, every single night, which means home is the one place you can't stand to be." She glanced over. "That's the important parts. The rest is just a name." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, very low, almost to the window, "That's more than I'm owed." She didn't know what to do with that. So she did what she did with everything she didn't know what to do with. "There's pie in the bag by your foot," she said. "Marcus made too much again. Eat first. Then we'll worry about the rest." His house, when they reached it, was not a house. It was a tall, narrow building on a good street with a dark glass door and no light in any window, and she pulled up to the curb and put the car in park and waited while he gathered himself to be a person again. He did it slowly. He turned his watch around his wrist, once, a small habit she had catalogued without meaning to. "You'll get home all right?" he asked. He asked it every night. It was the only thing he ever asked her. "Bus runs till 3. I'll be fine." She held out the keys. The brass tag swung. "These are yours, by the way. You keep nearly leaving them in the booth." He took them and closed his hand over hers around them for just a second, not holding, only steadying, the way you'd brace a thing you were afraid to drop. And then he was out of the car and up the steps, and the dark glass door took him in, and the building stayed dark. Della sat for a second in the warm, idling quiet. Then she walked the 4 blocks to the bus stop, with her apron still on under her jacket, and the smell of his car, leather and cold air, and something faintly expensive, still in her clothes. The warm night pressing close, and the pavement still giving back the day's heat through her thin shoes. And she told herself, the way she did every night, that tomorrow she would stop doing this. She had been telling herself that for 3 weeks. The building had been dark when he came in, and it was dark when he came back, and Elias Vane stood in the cold marble of the entry he had grown up in, and did not turn on a single light. He knew it by feel. The console where his father had dropped his keys for 30 years. The third stair that did not creak, because his father had paid a man specifically, so that it would not. The long hush of a place built to make people feel small in a way they would mistake for awe. He had spent his whole childhood learning to walk through this house without making a sound, and the skill had outlived the reason for it, the way skills do. His phone had been buzzing in his coat all night. He took it out now in the dark and looked at the screen. 11 missed calls. 9 of them from Roman Pike. He could see the shape of the messages without opening them. The gala, the gala, the gala. The season opener 3 weeks out, and the owner of the hotel had not set foot in his own lobby in 4 months. And the staff were frightened, and the board was circling, and Pike was holding the whole thing together with both fists, and could not understand why the man it all belonged to would not come downstairs. Elias put the phone face down on the console. In the dark he could just make out the portrait at the turn of the stair, his father, painted 10 years ago, in the lobby of the hotel that bore their name, one hand resting on the back of a chair, as though he had built the chair too, and might at any moment improve it. The Vane. 41 floors of it on the harbour, the name in brass over the doors. The name on the matchbooks and the robes and the little bottles of water. The name that had been the answer to every question Elias had ever been asked about who he was. You're the vein boy. You're going to run the vein. The vein never closes. His father had said that last one in this very hall, the winter morning before the ambulance, with a kind of pride that had frightened Elias more than the grief that came after, because it was the proudest he had ever seen the man, and it was about a building. 4 months. 4 months of the owner's suite on the 41st floor, with its bed he could not sleep in, its windows full of a view his father had loved, and he had never once, not once in his life, been asked whether he loved. 4 months of finding, somewhere past midnight, that the only place in the entire city where no one needed him to be a vein was a 24-hour diner on Harbour Street, with a flickering sign and bad decaf, and a waitress who looked at him like he was simply a tired man and not a 41-story obligation. He turned his watch around his wrist. It had been his father's. Everything had been his father's. He climbed the stairs in the dark, past the portrait, and did not look at it, and on the landing he stopped, because there in his coat pocket, warm from the night, was the small white paper bag of pie that the waitress had put by his foot, and he had carried it all this way without remembering it, and he stood on the dark stairs of his father's house and ate cold pie out of a paper bag with his fingers, and it was, without any competition at all, the best thing that had happened to him in 4 months. He did not know her name either. He had not let himself ask. A name was a thread, and a thread could be pulled, and the entire architecture of his life had taught him that anyone who learned his name learned, in the same instant, the building behind it, and looked at him differently forever after, measured him against 41 floors, and found, every time, that the man came up short of the address. She had not done that. She did not know there was a building. To her he was a man who could not sleep, and tipped like he'd broken something, and she drove him home anyway, and she had decided, out loud, that this was enough to know. He would have given the building to keep it that way. He thought that, on the stairs, with pie on his fingers, and he did not yet know how nearly true it was. He had tried, exactly once, to sleep in the owner's suite. It was on the 41st floor, the top of the vein, the rooms his father had kept for 30 years, and almost never slept in himself, because the old man preferred the narrow house on the good street, where a man could be properly alone with his ambitions. The suite was a museum of a certain idea of success, the long windows full of the harbour, the bed the size of a small country, the bar nobody drank from, the desk where 3 generations of vain men had signed the papers that turned the building into more building. Elias had moved into it in the spring, after the narrow house got too loud with absence, thinking that height might help, that he might sleep closer to the sky. He had lain in the enormous bed under the enormous window, with the whole lit city spread out below him like an inheritance, and he had not slept at all, because the suite did not feel like a home a man lived in. It felt like the inside of the name. It felt like sleeping in the lobby. Every surface in it had been chosen to impress a version of a man Elias had spent his life failing to become. And lying there in the dark he had understood that his father had built a fortress so beautiful and so cold that his own son could not rest inside it, and that this, more than the will or the funeral or the 41 floors, was the inheritance. A high, gorgeous, sleepless room with a view of everything and no one in it. There was a recording. He kept it on his phone and did not play it, and could not delete it. A voicemail, the last one, left the morning of the ambulance, his father's voice brisk and certain and entirely about the building. The Astor people are sniffing again, it said. Don't let them. The vein never closes. Call me back. 30 seconds. Not a single word in it that was not about the hotel. Elias had listened to it perhaps 4 times in 4 months, late in the cold suite, waiting each time for the part where his father said something to him. The son. The man. And there was no such part. There had never been such a part. And the absence of it was the loudest thing his father had ever said. He would put the phone face down and lie in the museum of a bed and think, with a clarity that shamed him, that he would have traded all 41 floors for one voicemail that ended with anything other than "call me back." That was the suite he could not sleep in. That was why, near midnight, he took the elevator down and the car out and drove across the bridge to a diner with a flickering sign, where a woman who did not know his name poured him bad coffee and let him sleep in a booth and asked him, at the curb, the only question anyone in his life had ever asked that was about him and not the building. "You'll get home all right?" He had no home. He knew it every night when she said it. And every night, for the length of that one sentence, the not having of it stopped feeling like the end of the world and started feeling like a thing two people might, conceivably, fix. They came for him on a Wednesday, the way they had been coming for 4 months, except this time, they came in person. He had agreed to one meeting. One. Pike had set it up in the smaller of the two boardrooms, the one with the long table his father had ordered from a mill in Belgium, and Elias had come down from the 41st floor in a suit he barely remembered owning and sat at the head of the table, because there was nowhere else to sit. The wood under his hands was cold and smooth as river stone, polished by 60 years of other men's palms, and it smelled of lemon oil and old money. The board of the Vane had looked at him with the careful, hungry patience of people who have been waiting a long time for a man to either lead or fall. "Mr. Vane," said the woman at the far end, Caroline Brandt, his father's old ally, who had known Elias since he was a boy in short pants in this lobby, and had never once spoken to him as anything but an asset under management. "We're glad to see you. We've missed you." She did not mean it the way the words meant. The season opener is in 3 weeks. The Astor Group has made a second offer for the property, a generous one, generous enough that the board would be derelict not to discuss it. Your father always said the vein never closes. But your father isn't here, and the man who is hasn't been seen in his own building since the spring, and we have 300 employees and a fiduciary duty, and so the discussion has to be had. She folded her hands. Either you come back and run this hotel the way it deserves to be run, or you let us sell it to people who will. There isn't a third option that the numbers permit. I'm sorry. I knew your father. He'd have wanted me to be plain with you. Elias sat at the head of his father's table and felt the old paralysis come up his spine like cold water. They were not wrong. That was the unbearable part. 300 people did work in this building, and he had been letting it list at sea for 4 months because he could not bear to climb back onto the bridge of a ship he had never wanted to captain, sell, and he betrayed his father and 300 families. Stay, and he betrayed the only version of himself that had ever felt real, the man in the booth on Harbour Street who was no one's heir. "I need time," he heard himself say. The thing he always said. "You've had 4 months," said Caroline Brandt, not unkindly, which was the worst way she could have said it. Pike walked him to the elevator afterward, the two of them alone in the marble hush. Elias expected another lecture. Pike had a 30-year supply of them. But the old man only stood there with his hands behind his back, looking up at the portrait at the top of the stairs, the father in the lobby with his hand on the chair he had probably wanted to improve. "They'll sell it," Pike said finally, "if you don't come back. I've counted the votes. They'll sell it to the Astor Group, and the Astor Group will gut the staff and put their own name over the doors, and your father's hotel will be a memory inside a year." He turned. His face was doing something Elias had never seen it do. "I have given this building 30 years. Mr. Vane, I came here as a bellman. Your father taught me everything I know. Most of it badly. All of it about the building and none of it about—" He stopped himself, buttoned his coat over whatever he had nearly said. "Come back. That's all. Come back and fight for it. I can't do it without an owner, and I have nowhere else to go. This is the only home I have." And he turned and walked back across the marble, an old man in a good suit, and Elias rode the elevator up to the 41st floor and stood at the window full of the view his father had loved, and understood that he was going to lose this building one way or another, to the Astor Group or to his own grief. and that the only thing in his life he was not prepared to lose was a diner on Harbour Street and the woman who ran it. It had started, the way these things do, with him at the end of himself. 3 weeks before, on the worst night of a long string of worst nights, Elias had walked into the Lantern at 11:45 because the light was on and he could not face the elevator to the 41st floor. He had ordered coffee he did not drink. He had meant to sit for 10 minutes and instead had sat for 2 hours. And somewhere in the second hour, the diner and the harbour and the warm summer dark had done what his own bed could not, and he had slept, sitting up, in a stranger's booth, for the first real sleep in weeks. He had woken to her clearing the cup, and he had stood to go, and the floor had come up at an angle, and a hand had closed on his arm, firm, unbothered, the hand of someone who had caught falling people before, and did not make it a drama. "Okay," she'd said. "Give me those." And she had driven him home in his own car. This stranger, this waitress, talking only when she had something worth saying, and she had not asked him a single question, and at the curb she had said, "You'll get home all right," as if he were the one she was worried about, and something in his chest that had been locked since winter had turned over. Once. Like an engine trying to catch. He had gone back the next night to prove it was nothing. And the night after that. And now it was 3 weeks, and the truth, which he turned over on the stairs like the watch on his wrist, was that the 2 minutes at the curb when she handed him the keys and said, "You'll get home all right," were the only 2 minutes of his day he looked forward to. The morning after the bridge, Pearl found Della in the back, prepping the coffee urns in a cloud of steam and the bitter bright smell of fresh grounds, her fingers stained dark at the tips, and Pearl leaned in the doorway with her arms crossed and her face arranged into the expression she used for delivering verdicts. "So," Pearl said. "Don't. I'm not saying anything. You're saying it with your whole body." Pearl uncrossed her arms, recrossed them the other way. 26 days, she said. "I counted. 26 nights you've driven that man home in his fancy car and walked yourself to a bus stop in the dark, and you don't know his name, and you bring him Marcus's pie like he's a stray you're not allowed to keep." She let that sit. "I just want it on the record that I see it. It's a ride home, Pearl. He's wrecked. He shouldn't drive. There's a service for that. It's called Every Cab in the City." Della set down the scoop. "He doesn't have anybody," she said, and was surprised by how sure she sounded. "You can tell. People who have somebody, they don't sit alone in a diner till 2, because the alternative is worse. He's got nobody, and he's drowning in the polite way where nobody can see it, and it costs me 20 minutes and a bus fare. That's all. That's the whole thing." Pearl studied her for a moment, and her face changed, softened into something that was almost worse than the teasing. "Okay," she said. "Just okay. But Della." She nodded at the urns, the apron, the whole small kingdom of the Lantern. "You do that. You find the one drowning person in the room and you swim out to them and you give them your 20 minutes and your pie and your bus fare. Every time. And then you walk home alone." Junie did the exact same thing. She paused. "I'm just saying, somebody ought to be swimming out to you, once in a while." It landed harder than Della let her see. Junie, her grandmother, the Lantern's founder, the woman who had taken in a foster kid nobody else would keep, and raised her behind a diner counter, and taught her that you earned your place in the world by being the one who showed up. Junie had slipped away 18 months ago in the back booth, with a crossword half done, and Della had been so busy keeping the doors open that she had not, she realized now, stopped to grieve her properly even once. "Yeah, well," Della said, and picked the scoop back up. "Nobody's drowning over here. Hand me the filters." She did not say the rest of it, the part she kept folded small and out of sight, that she drove a nameless man home every night, because being needed was the only thing she had ever been sure she was for, and that the day he stopped needing it, she did not know what she would be. That night he came in at his usual hour, and she brought his coffee without being asked, and he wrapped both hands around the cup the way he did. drawing the warmth up into his cold fingers, the steam fogging the dark glass beside him, and for the first time in 26 nights, he talked first. "You run this place," he said. It wasn't a question. He'd watched her long enough to know. "My grandmother ran it. I run it now, mostly. The owner lives in Arizona and cashes the rent and doesn't care what happens as long as it happens quietly." She refilled the sugars at the next table while she talked. Junie built it up from a lunch counter. 40 years. She's the reason half the night shift in this city has somewhere to sit at 3 a.m. That won't throw them out for ordering one coffee and crying. And now you keep it open. Somebody has to. He turned his cup. "Does anybody keep it open for you?" She stopped with the sugar jar in her hand. It was, almost exactly, Pearl's question, coming out of the mouth of a man who did not know her name. And it went in under her guard the way the first one hadn't. "That's a funny thing to ask a stranger," she said. "I'm asking because you don't ask me anything," he said, "and I've started to think that's not because you don't wonder. I think it's because you've decided your wondering doesn't get to take up room, and I recognize it." He looked at her then, fully, the way he didn't usually let himself. "I'm fairly good at recognizing it. I've been doing it my whole life." For a moment, neither of them said anything. The fan turned, the buoy tolled out past the pier. Warm summer breathed in through the open door, sweet with linden and salt. "Drink your coffee," Della said finally, gently. "It's getting cold, and you tip too much for cold coffee." But she sat down across from him for a minute, the first time she had ever done that, and she let the silence be a different kind of silence, and when she got up to take her tables, she felt his eyes follow her, and she thought, with something between alarm and a feeling she refused to name, well, there it is then. There was something else. The week before the trouble came, that Della would only understand the meaning of much later. The night bus home ran along the harbour road, past the foot of the Vane, and Della had ridden it 1,000 times without ever once looking up at the building, the way you stop seeing the largest thing on your own street. But that night, the bus stalled at the long light by the hotel's brass doors. And idling there in the dark, she happened to look in through the great lit panels of glass into the lobby. Empty at that hour. All that marble and gold standing in the late hush, like a held breath. And she saw a man. An old man, silver-haired, in a good suit, gone slightly rumpled with the hour. He was standing at the foot of the grand staircase, alone, in front of a large portrait she could not make out from the road, and as she watched he reached up and adjusted the frame a half-inch to the left, the way you straighten a thing in your own home. And then, he did not take his hand away. He stood with his palm flat against the bottom of the frame, his head bowed, an old man alone with a painting at 2 a.m. in an empty marble room, and there was something in the set of his shoulders that made Della look away. Fast, the way you look away from a person's grief when you have stumbled on it by accident and have no right to it. The light changed. The bus pulled on. She did not know who the man was, and she forgot about him by the time she reached her stop, and she would not think of him again until weeks later, when she understood that grief wears a good suit too, and that the people who guard a thing most fiercely are very often the ones who loved it and were never told that loving the building was not the same as loving the boy. The trouble arrived, as trouble does, in a good suit. It was the following week, a Tuesday, the diner half empty in the hollow stretch before midnight, the griddle ticking as it cooled, and the warm air thick with coffee and frying onions. When the man came in, he was tall and silver-templed, and dressed like money that wanted you to know it had taken pains, the sharp, clean smell of his cologne cutting through the kitchen warmth like a blade. And he stood in the doorway and let his eyes travel over the lantern, the cracked vinyl, the flickering sign, the laminate counter, with an expression of such precise, polite distaste that Della disliked him on sight and on principle. "I'm looking for someone," the man said. "I'm told he frequents this establishment." He produced a phone, turned it, showed her a photograph. It was her quiet regular, except not. This was a photograph of him in a different life, clean-shaven and pressed, and standing in a marble lobby under a brass sign. A man who looked like he had never once slept in a booth. "Don't know him," Della said, which was technically true. She knew the man in the booth. She did not know this one. The silver-templed man smiled without warmth. "I think you do. I think you drive him home. There are photographs." He let that land. "My name is Roman Pike. I am the general manager of the Vane, the hotel. Perhaps you've heard of it. It's only the most significant building on this harbor, and the man you've been ferrying about in the small hours is its owner. Mr. Elias Vane, whose family name is on 41 floors of real estate and who has not been seen in his own lobby in 4 months, and who is, I am increasingly concerned, being." He chose the word like a glove, cultivated. The word reorganized the whole room. Elias Vane. The Vane. She had walked past the brass doors 1,000 times. The brass tag on his keys, she saw it now. The rubbed bright shape of the letters she'd never been able to read in the bad light. Vane, and a room number. He owned it. He owned the most significant building on the harbor, and he came to her diner every night and slept in a booth and ate cold pie from a paper bag and let her drive him home, because it was the one place he could be no one. She kept her face flat. 20 years behind a counter had taught her that much. "Cultivated," she repeated. "It's an old story," Pike said, almost kindly, which was the worst part. "A man in grief. A great deal of money. A young woman of limited means and unlimited patience, who has, let us say, recognized an opportunity." He set a card on the counter, white and heavy. "I'm not a cruel man, miss." She didn't give it to him. "But I have served that family for 30 years, and I will not stand by while everything mistero. Vane's father built is talked out from under his son by someone he met in a diner. So, there is a number on that card. Whatever you imagine you're owed for your trouble, call it, and we'll settle it, and you'll find a new route home for yourself, and this ends cleanly. For everyone." He smiled again, including him. Della looked at the card. She looked at the photograph of the clean-shaven stranger, who was also the wrecked man in her booth. She felt something cold and old open up under her. The trapdoor she had spent her whole life walking carefully around. The certainty, drilled into her in 11 different foster houses before Junie, that she was useful and not chosen, tolerated and not kept. That the people with the good suits always, in the end, turned out to have been measuring her for the door. "Get out of my diner," she said quietly. Pike's eyebrows rose a fraction. "You came in here," Della said, and her voice did not shake, which she was proud of for the rest of her life. "And you looked at my grandmother's diner like it was something on your shoe. And then you offered to pay me to stop being kind to a man who falls asleep in that booth because he's so lonely he can't go home. 30 years you've served that family. You don't know him at all." She picked up the white card and held it out to him. "I don't want your number. I never wanted anything. That's the part you can't understand, so I'll say it slow. I don't want anything. Now take your card and get out, before I have Marcus walk you out." And Marcus used to box. Pike did not take the card. He looked at her for a long moment, and something flickered behind the polished face. Surprise, recalculation, she couldn't tell. And then he buttoned his coat. "We'll see," he said, "how long that lasts." And he left. And the bell over the door rang behind him in the warm night, and Della stood holding the card with her hands not quite steady, and understood that the simplest good thing in her life had just become complicated past saving. Elias came in an hour later and knew at once that something had happened. He always knew. It was the only thing he was reliably good at, reading the weather of a room. "What's wrong?" he said, before he'd even sat down. Della set his coffee in front of him. She had thought, in the hour since Pike left, about all the ways to do this, and had landed in the end on the only one she had ever known, which was the truth, told plainly, the way Junie had told everything. "Your manager came by," she said. "Mr. Pike, he showed me a photograph and offered me money to stop driving you home." She watched it hit him. Watched the 4 months of careful nothing he wore like the shapeless coat go very still. So I know who you are now. Elias Vane. The Vane. 41 floors. She kept her voice even. I wanted you to hear it from me, and not from the look on my face. For a long moment he didn't move. Then he closed his eyes, briefly, the way a man does when the thing he has been bracing for arrives anyway. I'm sorry, he said. He shouldn't have. I told him to get out. Elias opened his eyes. I gave him his card back, and I told him I didn't want his number, and I told him to get out of my diner. She sat down across from him, the second time ever, and she put her hands flat on the table so he could see they were steady now. I need you to hear something, and then we never have to talk about it again. I didn't drive you home for 26 nights because I thought there were 41 floors behind you. I drove you home because there was nothing behind you. Because you were a tired man who couldn't go home. And I had a car key in my hand and 20 minutes. That's the whole arithmetic. The building doesn't change it. The building doesn't change one single thing about it. She paused. It might change things for you. You might not be able to come here anymore, now that I know. I'd understand it. But I needed you to know that on my side of the table, nothing's different. She would remember, later, the way he looked at her then. As though she had handed him something he had been told his whole life did not exist, and had finally stopped believing in. It changes things, he said roughly. It changes. He stopped. Turned his watch. Most people. The instant they know. They get a different face. You don't have a different face. It's the only face I've got, Della said. Drink your coffee. And he laughed. It was a small, rusty, startled thing. A sound that seemed to surprise him as much as her. The first time she had heard it. The first time. She would have bet that he had made it in months, and it changed his whole face, and Della felt the floor of her own carefulness give way another quiet inch. You should do that more, she said. I'm out of practice. Yeah, well, she got up to take her tables. Practice here. We're open all night. So he did. That was the strange sweetness of the weeks that followed. The part Della would hold on to hardest when the cold came, that knowing his name, knowing the building, did not end it, but turned it. He still came in near midnight. She still drove him home, but now he talked, on the bridge. In the warm dark, the way she imagined he had not talked to anyone in years. He told her about his father, not the grief of it, not at first, but the smaller things, the third stair that didn't creak, the way the old man had said the vein never closes like a commandment. He told her he'd never been asked, not once in his life, whether he wanted any of it. She told him about Junie, about the 11 houses before the diner, about the crossword half done in the back booth. They traded their wounds slowly, the way you pay out a rope you're not sure will hold your weight, the words coming low under the hum of the tires and the warm wind through the cracked window. And the rope held. There was a night it rained, the first real rain of the summer, warm and sudden, drumming on the diner roof and turning Harbour Street into a sheet of moving light, and he stayed in the booth past closing while it came down. And she let him, and they sat on either side of the counter, with the rain loud overhead, and the open door breathing wet linden into the room, and she told him about the 11 houses. She had never told anyone the whole of it, not even Pearl, who knew most things. She told him about the family that had returned her after 9 weeks because she didn't fit. Like a coat. About the one good house before Junie where she'd let herself believe for almost a year, and the morning the social worker's car had pulled up anyway. About learning, somewhere in there, that the way to keep a roof over your head was to make yourself necessary to it. To be the kid who did the dishes without being asked, who watched the babies, who never once asked for anything, because the ones who asked for things got sent back. Junie was the first person who ever kept me when I wasn't being useful, she said. I was sick for 2 weeks the winter I came to her. Couldn't lift a tray. Useless. I kept waiting for the car. She turned her coffee cup, his habit. She'd caught it from him. It never came. She just made me soup and put me in the back booth with a crossword. That's when I knew I was staying, not when she took me in. When I was useless, and she kept me anyway. Elias listened to all of it, without once trying to fix it, which she had not known a person could do. And when she was finished, he was quiet for a while, and then he said, "My father kept me, because I was useful too." Air-shaped. I was very good at being air-shaped. The rain filled the silence. I don't think anyone has ever found out what I'm shaped like underneath, including me. He looked at her across the counter, the rain light moving on both their faces. I'd like to find out. That's a new feeling. I thought you should know it started here. There was a night he told her about the third stair, the one his father had paid a man to silence, and how, as a boy, he had sometimes stepped on the loud part of every other stair on purpose, just to make a sound in that house, just to be heard, and how his father had eventually had all the stairs fixed, and how that was in its way the whole story of his childhood, a boy making noise to be noticed, and a father quietly buying silence. She laughed at the wrong moment, helplessly, and then apologized, and he said no. It was funny. It was the first time it had ever been funny, and she understood that she had given him something just by laughing at it, that she had turned a wound into a story you could survive having told. The inside joke was the decaf. He had admitted, one night, that the lantern's decaf was objectively terrible, and she had been so offended on Junie's behalf that he had backpedaled into its adequate, and adequate had become the word they used for everything that was secretly wonderful. A good song on the car radio, adequate. The harbor at dawn, adequate. The first night he made a joke of his own, a dry, careful, deeply unfunny joke about Pike's Pocket Square, delivered in the car with his face perfectly straight, and she laughed so hard she had to pull over, and he watched her laugh with an expression of such open astonishment at his own competence that she had to look away, and he said, "Was that adequate?" And she said, that was barely adequate, and they were both, she realized, completely gone. And there was the night it turned the other way, the night someone finally swam out to her, and she nearly drowned from the strangeness of being reached. It was a Sunday, the slow tail of the week, and one of the regulars did not come in. Old Walt, who had taken the same stool at the end of the counter every night for 9 years, who tipped in exact change and did the jumble and called Della kid though she was nearly 30. Had not come in for 3 nights running, and on the third night a woman came instead, his daughter, to say that Walt had gone into the hospital and would not be coming out, and that he had asked her to tell the girl at the diner thank you, because the lantern was the only place that had ever felt like company since his wife passed. And then the daughter left, and Della stood behind the counter of her grandmother's diner and felt the floor of her chest go through, because Walt was Junie's. Walt was the kind of drowning person Junie had built the whole place to keep afloat, and Della had kept him afloat for 9 years 1 cup at a time, and had never once thought of him as anything but a duty she was glad to do. And now he was going, and she had not. She realized, said goodbye to a single one of the people she loved before the world took them. Not Junie, not Walt, because saying goodbye meant admitting they were hers to lose. She did not cry in front of the floor. She never did. She finished the shift. But Elias, in the corner booth, had watched the whole thing, had seen the daughter come and go, had read the wreckage in the set of Della's shoulders the way she had spent a month reading his, and when she came to take his cup at closing, he did not hand her the keys. "Sit down," he said. "I've got to close out the Della. Gently. Sit down. I'll drive you home tonight. Just this once. Sit down first." And she sat. And he did not try to fix it, because she had taught him, somewhere in the last weeks, that you do not fix grief. You only refuse to let it sit alone. And he poured her a cup of the terrible decaf with his own hands, clumsily, getting it wrong, too full, the warm cup trembling faintly against the saucer, and pushed it across the cool table to her the way she had pushed 100 cups across 100 tables to 100 drowning strangers. And he said, "Tell me about Walt." And she did. She told him about the jumble and the exact change and the 9 years, and somewhere in the telling she finally cried. For Walt, and for Junie 18 months late, the first crack in a wall that the lawyer's visit would later bring down entirely, and Elias sat across from her in the worst light in the diner, and let her, and did not look away. When it was over, he drove her home through the warm dark in his own car for the first time. Badly, too cautious at every light, and walked her to her door, and said, "You'll get inside all right?" Her own line, her nightly line, handed back to her like a key, and she stood in her own doorway, and understood that this was what it felt like to be, for once, the one swum out to, and that it was the most frightening thing that had ever happened to her, because now she had something she could lose. There was one night it almost broke, and it was his fault, and he knew it the second it happened. He had found out. She never learned how. She suspected Pearl, who would have meant well, that the Lantern's lease was up for renewal in the autumn, and that the Arizona owner was talking about selling the building out from under it to a developer who wanted the corner. And Elias, being a man who had spent his whole life solving problems by reaching for the largest tool in his hand, had quietly instructed his lawyer to buy the building, and had come to the diner that night pleased with himself in a way she'd never seen, and had told her, over his coffee, that she didn't need to worry about the lease anymore. That it was handled, that the Lantern was safe, that he'd taken care of it, and the floor had dropped out of the warmth. Just like that. "You bought the building," Della said. "I'm buying it. It's not. The paperwork's not done, but it's as good as. You'll never have to think about it again." He saw, too late, that something was wrong. "Della, it's the diner. I thought you thought I'd be grateful." Her voice was very quiet, which with her was the dangerous register, the one Pearl knew to clear the room for. "And I am. That's the thing you don't. I am grateful. That's what makes it so." She pressed her palms flat on the table to steady them. "Junie spent 40 years making this place so that nobody who walked in here would ever have to feel small for needing something. And you just made me feel small in it. In her diner. You reached into my life with your money, and you fixed the thing I couldn't fix. And now every day I stand behind this counter, I'll know I'm standing here, because a rich man liked me. That's not a gift, Elias. That's the exact thing Pike accused me of. Except, now it's true. Because you made it true." She stood up. "I didn't drive you home so you'd buy me a building. I drove you home so you wouldn't crash a car. There's a difference, and it's the whole difference, and if you can't feel it, then you've understood nothing about me at all." He sat very still, and she watched it land on him. Watched him understand that he had done to her exactly what his father had done to him. Reduced a person to a thing that could be improved by ownership, and the look on his face was so stricken that her anger went out of her all at once and left only the fear underneath it, naked on the table between them. "Unwind it," she said. "The purchase. I mean it. I'll take my chances with the lease like everybody else. And if you lose the diner, then I lose it honestly," she said, the way Junie would have. "Promise me." He promised. He unwound it the next morning, and he apologized properly, in the actual room, which she would later recognize as the first time she ever saw him be brave, and he never made that particular mistake again. But the fear it uncovered did not go back into hiding. It had seen daylight now. She knew, after that night, exactly how it would feel when the man she was falling for tried to solve her with his money, and some cold and watchful part of her began, without her permission, to wait for the larger version of it to arrive. What she did not tell him, what she folded small and kept out of sight, even from herself, most days, was the cold thing Pike had opened up, because Pike had been wrong about her motives, and right about the shape of the world. Men in good suits did, in the end, measure her for the door. And the better this got, the more certain she became that there was a version of this story where Elias Vane woke up one morning, no longer drowning, and looked at the waitress who had been useful to him during the worst 4 months of his life, and felt the particular embarrassed gratitude of the rescued, and very kindly, very generously, paid the bill and went back to his 41 floors. she would not have blamed him. That was the worst part. She had built her whole life on the principle that being needed was the rent she paid to be allowed to stay, and she could not, no matter how he laughed in the car, stop waiting for the lease to come due. The photographs Pike had mentioned did not stay in his phone. It was a small item. At first, a society blog. The kind nobody admitted to reading, and everybody read. A grainy long-lens picture of Della at the wheel of a dark, expensive car, with a sleeping man slumped against the window, under a headline that made her stomach turn over, the Vain Air's Mystery Midnight Girl. Then it was a second item. And a third, each one a little uglier than the last. Each one certain it had her number, the gold digger, the opportunist, the diner waitress who had her hooks in a grieving billionaire. The 11 different ways the world had of saying a poor woman who is loved by a rich man must be a thief. Because the alternative, that she might simply be loved, was not a story anyone knew how to sell. By the weekend there were 2 men with cameras across Harbour Street from the Lantern, and a steady trickle of the curious who came in to order 1 coffee and stare, and Pearl took to standing in the doorway with her arms crossed like a bouncer, telling the photographers exactly what she thought of their mothers. Marcus put a hand-lettered sign in the window. If you're not here to eat, you're in somebody's way. The regulars closed ranks around her the way the night shift does. The cab drivers, and the nurses, and the lonely, and the strange. Junie's whole congregation of the small hours, suddenly a wall between Della and the lenses. But it cost her, and she let no one see how much. Because every headline was the trapdoor, printed in a font. Every one of them said out loud the thing she had spent her whole life half believing, that a woman like her does not get loved, only used, and that the world will always assume the worst of her and be half right by accident. She read them late, alone, the cold glow of the phone harsh against her eyes in the dark of her room, her thumb moving over the smooth glass long after she'd told herself to stop. And then she made herself stop reading them, and she went to work. Because working was the one thing the 11 houses had left her that no headline could take. Elias was wild about it in a way that frightened her. He wanted to release a statement. To sue. To stand in front of a camera and tell the truth. And she had to take his face in her hands across the booth one night and tell him no, that a statement would only feed it, that she had survived worse with less, that the surest way to protect her was to refuse to perform for any of it. Let them write, she said. I know what's true. You know what's true. The diner knows. That's everybody whose opinion I've ever needed, and he had looked at her with such helpless fury on her behalf. The first person in her life to be angry that the world was unfair to her, rather than simply expecting her to absorb it, that she had nearly told him the whole of the cold thing then, the lease coming due, the door she was always braced for. But she folded it small instead, and kept it out of sight, the way she always did, and that was the mistake that the next month would make her pay for. The crisis came on a Thursday, and it came, as Pearl would say afterward, the way the good Lord sends weather, all at once and aimed. The Vane's summer gala was the hotel's biggest night, the season opener, 400 guests and the entire board, and a ballroom that had not gone dark in 60 years. And 3 days before it, the hotel's events director walked out, and the kitchen's refrigeration failed in the heat, the walk-ins going warm, the smell of milk on the turn creeping under the doors, $10,000 of fish sweating on melting ice, and the whole top-heavy machine of the place began, very quietly and very expensively, to come apart. Elias, who had not set foot in the building in 4 months, finally went. Pearl drove Della past it the next morning, and they saw the catering trucks and the chaos, and within a day it was clear that the owner who had been hiding from his own lobby did not know how to run a kitchen in a crisis, because he had never once in his life worked one. He called her at 1 in the morning. He had never called her. She heard it in his voice before he said a word. I don't know how to do this, he said. Just that. The most honest sentence she'd ever heard him say. The gala's in 2 days, and the kitchen's underwater and 400 people are coming, and the staff are looking at me like I'm supposed to, and I'm standing in the middle of my father's ballroom, and I don't know how to do a single thing. And the only person I want to call is you. Which is insane. Because you run a diner and this is the vein, and I don't even know why I'm— Okay, Della said, already reaching for her shoes. Okay, stop. I'm coming. What she knew, that he did not, was that a crisis in a kitchen is a crisis in a kitchen whether there are 4 guests or 400. She had run the lantern through a burst pipe on New Year's, through Junie's funeral. Through the night the power went out on the whole block, and she'd cooked by camp lantern for 40 stranded people and turned no one away. She walked into the Vane's vast cold ballroom at 2 a.m. in her diner clothes, past Roman Pike, who stared at her as though a stray cat had wandered into the opera, and she rolled up her sleeves. Right, she said to the frightened sous chef. Refrigeration's out, so we stop fighting it. What can we make that doesn't need it? What's already cold? What can we buy day of and serve fresh? She turned to the terrified events assistant. You've been doing the director's job for a year without the title. I can see it on you. So you're the director now? Congratulations. What's the seating problem? She turned to Pike, who had opened his mouth. Mr. Pike, you've run this place 30 years. You know every supplier and every favor anyone owes this building, so go call them. All of them. Now, and to Elias, last, quietly, just for him and you. You're going to walk that floor and shake every staff member's hand and tell them you're glad they're here. Because right now they're scared the ship is sinking, and the one thing that calms a scared crew is the captain showing up. That's the whole job tonight. That's all you have to do. You can do that. I can't. You can, she said. I've watched you do harder things, sitting in my booth. Go! And he went, and the kitchen turned. It turned slowly, the way a heavy thing turns, and then all at once. The ballroom's great kitchen was nothing like the lantern's narrow line. It was a cathedral of steel, 100 times the size, with twice the staff standing around in a paralysis of fear. Because no one had told them what to do, and the man who owned the place had been a ghost for 4 months. But a frightened kitchen is a frightened kitchen, and Della had been unfreezing frightened people her whole life. She found the walk-ins warm and the milk already turning, and she did not waste a breath grieving it. She walked the line. She learned names. Fast. The way you do behind a counter. The name is the first thing. The name turns a terrified body into a person who can take an order. The air in the great kitchen was thick and warm and sour, with the smell of softening dairy. The only sound the drip of melting ice and the hiss of the one oven still lit. She found the sous chef, Renata, who had been holding the whole kitchen together with her teeth and no authority, and she gave her the authority out loud, in front of everyone, so it would stick. She found the dishwasher nobody had spoken to all night, and asked him where the spare ice machine was. Because dishwashers know where everything is, and he knew, and the look on his face at being asked was a thing she would not forget. By 3 a.m. they had a plan that worked without a lick of heat, a raw bar built on the morning's fresh catch, citrus-cured and bright cold soups. Summer things, gazpacho and a chilled corn velout the pastry chef wept with relief to be allowed to make, charcuterie and stone fruit and the good bread baked off in the one oven that still ran, everything the heat could not spoil, everything that tasted, on a warm night, like the season itself instead of an apology for it. By 4 they had the suppliers. Pike, to his enormous credit, had worked the phones with 30 years of called-in favors, his old voice going hoarse, and by dawn 3 trucks of ice and fish and flowers were rolling toward the loading dock that yesterday had been a crisis and was now simply a Thursday. And through all of it, every half hour or so, Della would glance out through the service doors into the great dim ballroom and see Elias, not hiding, not gone, but moving slowly along the edges of the room where the night staff worked, shaking hands, learning names of his own, saying the simple human things she had told him to say. I'm glad you're here. We're going to be all right. Thank you for staying. She watched the staff straighten under it like plants turned toward a window. She watched a man learn at 32 the one thing his father had never taught him, which was that a building is only ever the people inside it, and that the whole job of the man at the top is to make the people at the bottom believe the ship is not sinking. By dawn, the Vane's staff would have walked into a fire for him, and he had done nothing but shake their hands and mean it, and Della, watching him through the steam, understood that she had not saved the gala at all. She had only handed him the kitchen so he could save himself. And somewhere around 4 a.m, with the seating chart solved, and the suppliers called, and the staff steadied, Roman Pike found Della alone by the cold ovens, drinking a glass of water, and stood there with 30 years of certainty visibly cracking down the middle. "You don't want anything," he said. It was not quite a question. "No, I've spent 4 months," Pike said slowly, trying to get him to come back to this building. "You did it with one phone call in the middle of the night." He looked at her, and the polished distaste was gone, and what was under it was just an old man who had loved a family the only way he knew how, badly, through the building. "I was wrong about you. I want that on the record." He hesitated. His father would have hated you. That's the highest compliment I am capable of giving. His father hated anyone who treated that boy like a person instead of an heir. It was the first true thing Pike had ever said to her, and Della understood, with a small ache, that the old man was grieving too, in his stiff and terrible way, and that she had just made an unlikely friend in the wreckage. What she did not understand, what no one told her, was that Elias Vane had walked the floor that night exactly as she'd said, shaking every frightened hand, and had stood at last in the center of his father's ballroom under the brass that bore his name, and had finally understood something that 4 months of grief had hidden from him, that he did not want any of it. Not the way his father had wanted it. He did not want 41 floors. He wanted the woman in the diner clothes giving orders by the cold ovens. He wanted the bridge at 2 a.m. and the bad decaf, and the word adequate. And he had decided, standing there, with the clear, terrible certainty of a man who has finally located the one true thing in his life, what he was going to do about it. The gala was, by every account, the best in the hotel's history, and Elias did not stay for the end of it. He left it to his new events director, and his steadied staff, and a visibly transformed Pike. And at 2 a.m, while 400 guests danced under the brass, he drove himself, for the first time in months, to the Lantern, and found Della closing up, and stood in the doorway in his gala suit looking so unlike the wrecked man from the booth that she laughed. "Look at you," she said. "Adequate. Come up to the roof," he said. "I want to show you something." It was the dangerous hour, the sweet one, the one Della would walk back through 1,000 times after. He took her up to the roof of the Vane in the freight elevator, the workers' elevator, because he said it had the best view and the marble lobby had never once felt like his. And they came out into the warm summer dark 41 floors above the harbour, with the whole city laid out below them like something spilled. He had brought, in a paper bag, 2 coffees from the Lantern. The Lantern's terrible decaf, carried up to the top of the most significant building on the harbour. "You didn't," she said. "I did." He handed her a cup. "I wanted to drink the worst coffee in the city in the best spot in the city. With you." He looked out over the harbour, the buoy light, the bridge they crossed every night strung with lights below them. "I've been coming here in the daytime, the last few weeks, standing up here, trying to feel what my father felt about it." He turned the cup in his hands. "I don't. I never have. But last week I came up here and I thought, I'd like to bring her up here. And it was the first time this building has ever felt like it could be good for something." He glanced at her, almost shy. "That's all. I just wanted you to be up here, where I think about you." Della stood with the warm wind off the water lifting her hair and a paper cup of Junie's terrible decaf in her hand, 41 floors above the diner, where she had spent her whole life being useful, and let herself, for 1 whole minute, believe it. Believe that she was a person someone climbed to the top of a building to think about. Believe she could be chosen, and not just kept. "This is barely adequate," she said, because she could not say the other thing. "It's the most adequate thing I've got," he said. And they stood there in the warm dark and did not touch and did not need to. And it was, the two of them would agree much later, the happiest either of them had ever been. Which was exactly, of course, why it could not last. The lawyer came on a Monday morning, which was the first thing that was wrong, because nothing good has ever come to a diner at 9 on a Monday morning. Della was setting up the urns when the bell rang, and a woman came in, early 60s, silver bob. A soft leather case. The unhurried calm of someone who bills by the hour and has never once been late. She asked for Della Marsh by name, which was the second thing that was wrong, and she set the leather case on the counter and opened it, and she took out a single brass key on a ring with a rubbed bright tag, cold and heavy as a coin, and a thick cream envelope, and she laid them on the laminate between them with a small hard click that Della felt in her teeth. "My name is Harriet Lowe," she said. "I represent Mr. Elias Vane. I've been instructed to deliver these to you in person." She slid the key across the counter. "It's the master key to the Vane, the hotel, and this, the envelope, is a deed of transfer and an accompanying letter. As of this morning, Miss Marsh, ownership of the Vane Hotel, the building, the operation, the entirety of it has been transferred into your name. Mr. Vane has signed everything. It's done. It's legal. It's irrevocable." She folded her hands. "The keys are yours. The hotel is yours. I'm told you'll have questions, and I'm authorized to answer most of them, but I was asked to begin with the keys. Because Mr. Vane said she consulted nothing. She had it by heart. He said, 'Tell her I'm sorry I couldn't do it myself. Tell her it was the only thing I had that was worth giving.'" The diner was very quiet. The fan turned. Pearl had gone still at the pass. Della looked at the brass key on the counter. The same rubbed bright tag she had handed back to him at the curb 26 times, 50 times, every night, saying, "These are yours." Vane, and a room number. The most significant building on the harbour, in her name, on a Monday morning, delivered by a lawyer, with a message that said it was the only thing I had that was worth giving. And the trapdoor she had spent her whole life walking around opened up underneath her, clean and silent, and she went straight through it. Because she heard it, all of it, in an instant, the way you hear a whole song from one bar. He was paying the bill. The rescued man, no longer drowning, restored to himself by the gala and the roof and the worst 4 months of his life behind him now. He had done the math of what he owed the waitress who'd carried him through it, and he had found the largest possible number, and he had handed it to her through a lawyer, because he could not face doing it in person. Because what do you say to the help when you're settling up? It was generous. It was kind. It was a 41-story goodbye. He was giving her the building so that he would never have to come to the diner again, so that she would be paid in full, and the lease would be up, and the useful woman could be useful somewhere else now, somewhere that wasn't his life. The only thing I had that was worth giving, not me, the building. He had reached for the largest thing he owned, and it had not, even at the end, been himself. "No," Della said. Harriet Lowe blinked. In 40 years she had clearly never once heard that word in this room. "Take it back." Della slid the key across the counter, the way she'd slid Pike's card, the same motion exactly, and her hands were not steady this time and she did not care. "Take it back. I don't want it." "Tell him." Her voice cracked, and she pressed it flat. "Tell him I drove him home because he was drowning, not because I wanted to be paid for it, and the difference between those two things is the only thing I've ever. Tell him I gave the key back. He'll understand. He nearly leaves it in the booth every night. Tell him I gave it back." And she walked into the kitchen, and she did not come out, and behind her she heard Pearl say, very quietly, to the lawyer, "You should go. Leave the key. She'll just leave the key and go." In the kitchen, by the cold ovens of her grandmother's diner, Della pressed the rough cotton of her apron to her face, breathing in the old smell of bleach and griddle smoke that meant home, and grieved, Junie, finally. 18 months late, and the man on the bridge, and the version of herself she'd let live for 1 whole minute on a roof 41 floors up, the one who'd believed she could be chosen. She let herself believe the worst thing, the way the wounded do, all the way down to the bottom of it, that she had been, in the end, exactly what 11 foster houses had told her she was. Useful, paid, released, she did not see the letter. The thick cream envelope sat unopened on the counter all morning, the key beside it, while the urns went cold. He did not understand it. When Harriet called, Elias stood in the owner's suite on the 41st floor, packing. He had been packing, that was the thing. The cold light off the harbour falling flat across the half-filled boxes, the phone pressed hard to his ear, and the lawyer's careful voice telling him she had given the key back. She said to tell you she gave it back. She said you'd understand. And he did not understand. He understood nothing. Because he had done the bravest thing he had ever done in his life, and it had come back to him as a no. He had thought it through for 2 weeks. He had decided it on the roof, watching her hold the terrible coffee against the city. He did not want the vein. He had never wanted it. But he could not simply abandon it. 300 people worked in that building. Pike had given it 30 years. His father had given it everything. So the question had been how to set it down without dropping it on someone's foot. And the answer, the obvious, blazing answer, had been her. The one person he had ever met who ran a place not for what it gave her, but for who it kept warm. She had taken his father's ballroom in a crisis and made it human in a single night. She would be a better steward of 41 floors than any Vane had ever been, because she would see the night shift dishwasher before she saw the brass. And this was the part he had not said in the letter clearly enough. He realized now, with a horror that climbed his spine, and he had given her the building so that they would be equals, so that he could come to her not as a rescued man to his rescuer, not as a Vane to a waitress, not as 41 floors to a bus fare, but as a man with nothing left to offer but himself, standing level with her at last. He had given away everything he had, so that the only thing left to give would be the thing that mattered. The only thing I had that was worth giving. He had meant it as the throat clearing before the real sentence. He had meant the building was the throat clearing. He had meant himself as the sentence. And he had been such a coward about the second half that he had sent the first half by lawyer and gone home to pack a bag. And she had heard a goodbye, because of course she had. Because he had dressed the most important thing he would ever say in the costume of a transaction and handed it to her through a stranger. She thinks I'm paying her off, he said. I believe, said Harriet low. With the gentleness of a woman who had watched the rich misunderstand love for 40 years, that is precisely what she thinks. The letter is still on the counter, unopened, if it helps. She didn't read it. A pause. Mr. Vane, if I may. In my experience, the only thing that has ever once worked, in a situation of this kind, is the truth, spoken by the actual person, in the actual room. Not a deed, not a key, not me. Another pause. You're not very practiced at the actual room, are you? No, Elias said. I'm not. Then I'd start now, she said, before the urns go cold for good, and she hung up. The dark night, Pearl would say later, lasted 3 days, and was the worst 3 days the lantern had seen since Junie passed. And the only mercy in it was that Della was too proud to close, so at least the doors stayed open, while her heart didn't. She worked. She always worked. She opened the urns and ran the floor, and turned no one away. And at night she did not look at the booth in the corner where the light was worst. And when a man came in tired, she felt the old pull to swim out to him, and made herself stay on the shore for once. Because, look where the swimming got you. And in the small hours, when the diner emptied and there was nothing left to scrub, the worst thoughts came, and she let them, because she had decided that this time she would not lie to herself about what she was. Maybe Elias really had been counting the cost all along, she told herself, the way the rich count everything. Maybe 4 months of being driven home had simply been a debt accruing in a ledger she'd been too foolish to see. Maybe the man on the bridge had never once forgotten the address behind him, and the whole gentle architecture of it, the letters, the roof, the worst coffee in the city carried up 41 floors, had been the long, courteous process of a man working out the most generous possible way to be rid of her. Maybe she had been, from the first night to the last, exactly what 11 foster houses had measured her for. Useful, and then paid, and then returned. The thoughts were not loud. They were worse than loud. They were reasonable. They sounded exactly like the truth, and Della had never in her life had any defense against a thing that sounded like the truth. Because the truth was the only currency Junie had ever let her trade in. She told herself she had been right. She told herself the no had been the only true thing she had, and she had said it, and that was that. Men in good suits measured you for the door. She had simply, this once, opened the door herself before he could, and walked through it first. Which was almost the same as being chosen, if you didn't look at it directly. The key sat in the drawer, under the register where she'd thrown it. The cream envelope sat beside it, unopened. She did not read it. Reading it was a door too, and she had decided she was done walking through doors. On the third night, Pearl came and stood over her while she counted the drawer and said, "You're going to want to be angry at me, and I'm going to let you, but I'm saying it anyway." She put the unopened envelope on the counter between them. "You give everybody in this city their 20 minutes. Every drowning stranger. You swam out to a man for a month who couldn't even tell you his name, and you asked for nothing. Because you decided a long time ago that wanting something was a thing other people got to do, and not you." Her voice was not unkind. It was the unkindest thing about it. And the one time, Della, somebody swam out to you. Swam out with the biggest thing he had. You decided before you even read the letter that it had to be a trick. Because a person actually choosing you doesn't fit the story Junie's 11 houses wrote in you, and you'd rather throw the key in a drawer than find out you were wrong about being unlovable. She tapped the envelope. He didn't measure you for the door. You measured yourself for it. You always do. Read the letter. Or don't. But stop telling yourself you said no because you're brave. You said no because you're scared. And there's no shame in scared, but there's a lot of shame in calling it the other thing. And she went back to the kitchen and left the envelope on the counter, and left Della alone with it, and the fan turned, and the buoy tolled out past the pier. And after a long time, in the empty diner at 2 in the morning, Della Marsh picked up the cream envelope and broke the seal and read what Elias Vane had not been brave enough to say out loud. It was short. He was not, even on paper, a man of many words. "Della," it said, and she stopped. Because he had never once written her name, had not known it for a month, and here it was in his careful hand, Della, like he'd been practicing it. "I am giving you the building because it is the largest thing I own, and I needed to get it out of my hands. Not as payment, as subtraction. For my whole life, everyone who came near me saw 41 floors first, and me second. Or not at all, and I have never once been able to tell whether anyone wanted the man or the address. You are the only person alive who only ever saw the man. Because you didn't know about the address, and the morning you found out, you told me nothing was different on your side of the table. So I am making it true. I am taking the address off the table. I am giving the whole thing away so that when I come to you, and I am coming to you, the second I am brave enough, which Harriet tells me should have been today, there will be nothing left in my hands to confuse it. No flaws, no name, no bill to settle. Just a man who can't sleep unless he knows you got home all right, asking if he can drive you. For once, instead, that is the only thing I have left that is worth giving, and it was always the only thing I meant. I'm sorry I dressed it up as a key. I have spent my whole life being dressed up as a building. I should have known better than to do it to you. Della read it twice. Then she sat down in the booth in the corner where the light was worst. The booth where Junie had slipped away with a crossword half done. The booth where a nameless drowning man had slept for the first time in weeks, and she put the letter against her chest and cried for the 4th time in 18 months. Except this time, it was the other kind. He came at dawn. Of course he came at dawn. It was the only hour either of them had ever trusted. She heard the car. She knew the sound of it now the way she knew the diner, the held breath of it. And she looked up from the booth and through the plate glass, gone gold and warm, with the summer sunrise coming up over the harbour, the early light laying a bright stripe across the cold counter, and she saw him get out. No gala suit. No good shapeless coat. Just a man in a plain shirt with his sleeves pushed up, who had clearly not slept, standing on the sidewalk outside the lantern looking at the door like the door might say no. She got up and unlocked it and propped it open the way Junie always had, to let the morning in. "We're closed," she said. "I know." He didn't come in. He stood on the threshold in the gold light, with his hands open at his sides, nothing in them, exactly as he'd planned it, exactly as the letter said, nothing in his hands at all. Harriet said, "You read the letter." I read it. I should have said it in person. I knew it the second she called. "I've been sitting outside for an hour trying to be brave enough to," he stopped. Turned his watch, once, and then made himself stop doing that too, and stood there with his empty hands and let her see him be afraid. "I don't want the building. I never wanted the building. I gave it to you, because it was the only way I could think of to stand in front of you with nothing, so that, if you ever, so that it would have to be about me. Just me. And then I was such a coward I sent the nothing by lawyer." A breath. "I'm not being a coward now." So, here it is, in the actual room. He looked at her, the man from the booth, the man she'd driven home 50 times, scared out of his mind and saying it anyway. "I'm not drowning anymore. You did that. You and your diner and your terrible coffee and the bridge. And I was so afraid that meant you were done with me. That you only knew how to love somebody who needed saving. And the day I stopped needing it, you'd hand me back like the keys at the curb. So I needed you to know I'm not here, because I need saving." His voice went rough. "I'm here because I want you, not your 20 minutes, not your bus fare. You, the whole, the actual person, the one who never asks for anything. I want to spend the rest of my life being the somebody who swims out to her." He swallowed. "That's all. That's the whole arithmetic. It was always the only thing I meant." Della stood in the doorway of her grandmother's diner with the gold morning coming up behind him off the water, and she thought about Junie and the 11 houses and the trapdoor she'd lived her whole life walking around, and she found that for the first time she could remember she did not want to walk around it. She wanted to walk straight across it and trust the floor and see. "You gave away a 41-story building," she said, "so you could ask me out properly. It seemed proportionate. It was insane. You have to take it back. I'm serious, Elias. I'm not running a hotel. I run a diner." "I don't. We'll figure it out," he said. And she heard the we, and so did he, and they both went still at it. "The keys," she said. "I gave the keys back. I noticed. You're terrible at keeping things that are yours." He almost smiled. "It runs in the building. I nearly leave them in the booth every night." And Della laughed, the wet, cracked, relieved laugh of a woman climbing up out of a trapdoor she'd lived above her whole life, and she crossed the threshold of the diner into the gold light. And she did the one thing she had never once done in 50 nights at the curb, the thing she had wanted to do and folded small and kept out of sight. She reached out and took his hand. His warm hand, the broad rough palm of it, the one that had handed her the keys 50 times. She held it, feeling his pulse jump under her fingers. "Okay," she said. "Then drive me home. For once. You drive. It's 7 in the morning. I've been up all night reading a letter from a coward. I'm exhausted. And you finally learned how to be brave. So you can drive." She tugged his hand. "Come on." And Elias, She looked up at him, at the man. Only ever the man. The building. We give it to Pike. Not all of it. But he loves it the right way now. The human way, you said it yourself. And he gave it 30 years. And he should run it. And you and I are going to find out what we actually want. Together, like normal people who didn't meet because one of them was drowning. She paused. And I want to keep the diner. Junie's diner. Whatever else. That's not negotiable. That's not negotiable, he agreed. Okay then. There was one more thing he had to do, and it cost him the one thing he had spent his whole life protecting, which was the right to be no one. The society blogs had made Della a villain for a month, and a single quiet statement would not undo it, and Elias knew it, and so he did the opposite of quiet. He called the one reporter who had been least cruel, and he sat down in front of a camera he had spent 4 months hiding from, in the lobby of the hotel that bore his name, under his father's portrait. And he told the truth with his own face, that he had been a man drowning in grief who could not sleep in his own home, that a waitress on Harbour Street had driven him home every night for a month, and asked for nothing, and did not even know his name. He said the photographs the city had been selling as a scandal were in fact the only decent thing that had happened to him in a year. That the woman they had called a gold digger had given his own building back to him, rather than keep it, which was not a thing any opportunist in the history of the world had ever done, and that if anyone wished to keep printing lies about her, they would be printing them about the woman he intended to spend his life proving worthy of, and he had a great deal of time, and a great deal of money, and would spend all of it correcting the record. It ran everywhere. It was undignified. His father would have been appalled. It dragged the vain name through exactly the kind of public feeling his father had spent 60 years keeping it above, and it was the freest Elias had ever felt, standing in the lobby that had owned him, spending the family dignity like loose change to buy one woman's good name back. The cost was real. The privacy he had guarded his whole life was gone for good. He found he did not miss it at all. The board, faced with an owner who had finally come back to life, and a hotel that had just had the best season opener in its history, quietly let the Astor offer die. Caroline Brandt came to him afterward, the old ally, and looked at him for a long moment with something he had never once seen on her face, which was respect for the man rather than the asset. Your father would have hated all of this, she said. The camera, the feeling, the girl. A pause. I think it might be the first thing you've ever done that was entirely your own. I'm sorry it took us so long to let you. It was as close to an apology as the board would ever come, and Elias took it, because he had learned that summer to take the apology that was offered rather than wait for the one he was owed. They did, in the end, give most of the building back to a thunderstruck Roman Pike, who received the news in his office with 30 years of certainty finally breaking all the way open, and who came to Della 2 days later with a small, terrible, sincere thing in his hands, the photograph from his phone, the clean-shaven stranger in the marble lobby, printed and framed. I took it the day his father made him manager of the front desk, Pike said stiffly. He was 23. He hated it. I never noticed, in 30 years, that he hated it. You noticed in a week. He set the frame on the counter, the apology with its cost, the old man surrendering the only story he had, the story where loving the building was the same as loving the boy. I was wrong about a great many things. I'd like to keep the hotel human, the way you ran the gala. I'd like you to tell me when I'm doing it wrong. You're the only one who would. It was, from Roman Pike, the equivalent of falling to his knees, and Della shook his hand, and they understood each other. Two people who had loved a drowning man the only ways they knew how. It was full summer by the time the lantern got its new sign, Junie's name finally on it in proper letters, paid for out of a building Della had owned for exactly 6 days, and the diner stayed open all night the way it always had, turning no one away. The one place on Harbour Street where the drowning of the city could sit with a terrible coffee and not be thrown out for crying. Pearl ran the floor with her. Marcus still made too much pie. And on the slow warm nights near closing, with the linden smell drifting in through the prop door and the fan turning its useless circle over the register, A man would come in a little before midnight, not wrecked anymore, not hiding, just home, and take the booth in the corner where the light was worst, and wrap both hands around a warm cup of the worst decaf in the city, the steam soft against his face, and wait. And at 2 a.m, Della would hang up her apron and cross the floor and stand over him and say, "We're closing," and he would look up at her with the small unclenching that had started it all, 50 nights and a lifetime ago, and he would set the keys to the car into her open palm every time, because it had become their joke and their vow at once. "Drive me home," he'd say. "You drive. You always say that. You never let me." She'd say, and take the keys anyway, the brass tag swinging, a different key now, an ordinary one, to an ordinary apartment they'd picked together, 4 blocks from a diner with her grandmother's name in lights. "Get in. There's pie in the bag by your foot." And they would drive out onto Harbor Street into the warm summer dark, the city unspooling clean and empty, and theirs, the harbor lights sliding slow and blue across both their faces now, and somewhere out past the pier the buoy would toll, and he would say, the way he said every single night, the only thing he had ever needed to ask her, "You'll get home all right?" And she would reach over, in the dark, and find his hand on the seat between them, and hold it, and know, all the way down, past every trapdoor, that for the first time in her whole careful life the answer was simply, plainly, adequately, yes. She was already home.